Most men believe relationships fail because they choose the wrong woman. That belief is comfortable. It protects the ego. It's also incomplete. The real failure usually happens much earlier, long before commitment, long before love, long before conflict becomes visible. It happens when a man enters a dynamic without realizing he is already being evaluated and never once considers evaluating in return. From the first conversation, I was being tested. Not aggressively, not maliciously, quietly, subtly. My confidence, my boundaries, my emotional control, my willingness to tolerate discomfort just to keep attention. And for a long time, I didn't see it. I thought I was being patient, understanding, easy to be with. In reality, I was teaching women how little resistance they would face. What changed my life wasn't learning how women test men. It was learning that I had the right and the responsibility to test back, to observe, to pause, to decide who deserved access to my time, my energy, and my future. This story isn't about resentment. It's about clarity. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if this kind of quiet, uncomfortable truth matters to you, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. I didn't realize I was being evaluated because no one ever told me evaluation was happening. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no obvious checklist. It unfolded through small moments that felt insignificant at the time. A late arrival, a casual comment about an ex, a minor disagreement that turned emotional faster than it should have. Each moment looked ordinary. Together, they formed a pattern. And that pattern was not random. From the first interaction, she was observing how I carried myself. Not what I said, but how I responded. Did I rush to explain myself? Did I apologize too quickly? Did I adjust my behavior the moment she showed discomfort? These weren't conscious traps. They were pressure points. And pressure reveals structure. It shows what holds and what collapses. Most men misunderstand this phase. They think attraction is built by impressing, by being agreeable, by proving usefulness. I believe that too. I thought if I showed consistency, patience, and emotional availability, things would naturally stabilize. What I didn't understand was that stability means nothing if it's achieved through self-erasure. Calm achieved by surrender isn't strength, it's permission. She watched how I handled uncertainty, when plans changed, when expectations weren't met, when something didn't go smoothly. I thought flexibility meant maturity. Sometimes it does, but constant flexibility signals something else. It suggests a lack of internal structure. It suggests I was more afraid of losing approval than committed to my own standards. There's a moment early in every dynamic when a woman decides how much resistance she can expect. Not resistance as hostility, resistance as self-respect. The kind that doesn't need to argue, the kind that doesn't negotiate its own boundaries. I didn't know that moment existed. I missed it. And once it passes, it rarely returns. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that it feels benign, even flattering. Attention feels good. Interest feels validating. When someone leans in emotionally, it triggers relief. The relief of being chosen, of being seen. That relief makes men careless. It lowers their vigilance. They stop observing and start performing. I was performing a role I thought women wanted. Calm, available, understanding. I didn't realize that by removing friction, I was removing contrast. By absorbing every inconvenience, I was signaling that my time had no cost. By accepting every emotional fluctuation, I was positioning myself as a stabilizer, not a man with his own gravity. The evaluation never stopped. It only escalated. Small tests turned into expectations. Expectations turned into assumptions. Assumptions turned into entitlement. And because I had passed every test by yielding, the standard of behavior kept shifting. What once would have been appreciated became expected. What was once optional became mandatory. The imbalance was clear in hindsight. She was learning who I was under pressure. I was learning how to avoid pressure altogether. She was gathering information. I was seeking approval. That asymmetry decided the outcome before the relationship ever had a chance to form on equal ground. Most men think the problem is women being too demanding. That's not accurate. The problem is men teaching women that demands will be met without consequence. When there is no cost, there is no calibration. Behavior expands until it meets resistance. If it never meets resistance, it keeps expanding. I didn't lose respect because I was weak. I lost it because I was undefined. I hadn't drawn clear lines. I hadn't demonstrated that my presence was conditional on mutual regard. I offered access without evaluation, and unearned access is never valued. What makes this difficult to accept is that none of it feels intentional. There's no villain, no conspiracy, no manipulation in the way men imagine it. This is how humans assess risk and value. Women do it relationally. Men often don't do it at all. They assume interest equals intent. It doesn't. Interest is curiosity. Intent is investment. And investment only happens when there is something at stake. I learned this the hard way by watching patterns repeat. Different women, same outcomes. The common variable was me. Not my personality, not my looks, not my effort. My framework. I entered every interaction hoping to be chosen instead of deciding whether I should choose. That mindset changes everything. When you wait to be chosen, you tolerate behavior you wouldn't otherwise accept. You rationalize. You minimize. You delay decisions you should make early. You trade long-term stability for short-term reassurance. The evaluation phase is not a phase you pass through. It's the foundation. If it's built on imbalance, everything above it leans. You can't correct it later with communication. You can't negotiate respect after teaching someone it isn't required. Once I saw this clearly, I stopped feeling confused. The chaos made sense. The emotional swings made sense. Even the loss of attraction made sense. I hadn't failed because I didn't give enough. I failed because I gave without discernment. Understanding that was uncomfortable. It stripped away excuses. It forced responsibility back onto me. But it also returned something I hadn't realized I'd lost: agency. From that point forward, I stopped asking how to avoid being tested. That's impossible. Testing is constant. I started asking a different question. What information am I gathering right now? What am I learning about her responses, her expectations, her limits? That shift didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. And clarity is what creates balance. Once I accepted the testing was happening, the patterns became impossible to ignore. What I had previously labeled as random behavior revealed a structure. Each interaction carried information. Each moment of friction wasn't a problem to solve, but a signal to read. One of the first tests appeared in time. She showed up late. Not dramatically late. Just enough to be noticeable. No apology that matched the delay. I told myself it didn't matter. I adjusted. I waited. I smiled when she arrived. I thought I was being relaxed. What I was actually communicating was that my time was flexible, but hers was protected. That imbalance was noted. Another test came through language. She mentioned her ex, not once. Repeatedly, not in pain, casually, as if his presence still occupied space. I felt a tightening in my chest and said nothing. I didn't want to appear insecure. I thought silence meant strength. But silence without internal grounding isn't strength. It's avoidance. What she was watching wasn't whether I reacted. It was whether I remained centered. I wasn't. I was suppressing. Then there were the emotional spikes. Minor issues inflated into tension. A misunderstood text. A delayed response. A comment taken personally. Each time I tried to smooth it over, I explained. I reassured. I absorbed. I believed emotional management was part of being a good partner. I didn't realize I was training her nervous system to discharge onto mine. These moments weren't conscious manipulation. That's an important distinction. They weren't strategies designed to control me. They were instinctive probes. Pressure applied to see what gives. Pressure reveals hierarchy. It shows who adjusts and who holds. When a woman makes an unreasonable request, she's not always expecting compliance. She's watching the response. Does he pause? Does he evaluate? Does he negotiate from calm authority? Or does he rush to accommodate to preserve harmony? Harmony purchased with self-sacrifice never lasts. At the time, I believed being accommodating would build trust. What it built was predictability. And predictability without boundaries leads to entitlement. When every request is met, requests escalate. Not because she's cruel, but because the environment allows it. What most men fail to see is that these tests are layered. They don't happen one at a time. They overlap. A boundary test might be wrapped in emotional expression. An investment test might be disguised as vulnerability. A competition test might appear as casual storytelling. If you only see the surface, you miss the function. There was a moment that clarified this for me. She created a small conflict over something trivial. The tone shifted. The atmosphere tightened. I felt the familiar urge to fix it, to restore calm. I caught myself. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I acknowledged the emotion without surrendering my position. I stayed steady. The change was immediate, not dramatic, subtle. The tension dissolved faster than usual. Respect entered the space. Not warmth, respect. That was the moment I understood what the tests were measuring. Women test emotional stability not to provoke chaos, but to see if a man can remain coherent under it. A man who becomes reactive under pressure is dangerous. Historically, he makes poor decisions when stakes are high. A man who stays grounded signals leadership, safety, direction. They test boundaries because boundaries define structure. A man without boundaries has no frame. Without a frame, there is no polarity. Without polarity, attraction collapses. What many men call kindness is often just boundary avoidance dressed up as virtue. They test investment because investment reveals desperation. Overinvestment early signals scarcity. It tells her that he has few options and is willing to overextend to secure her interest. That doesn't inspire desire. It creates caution or exploitation. They test competition because it exposes self-perception. A man who reacts with jealousy communicates that he believes he's replaceable. A man who remains unaffected communicates that he sees himself as an option, not a placeholder. None of this is personal. That's what makes it difficult. Men personalize these moments. They think they're being judged morally. They're not. They're being evaluated structurally. Does this man hold shape under pressure? Or does he collapse and reconfigure himself to maintain approval? My mistake was thinking the correct response was emotional suppression. It's not. Suppression creates internal instability. The correct response is emotional regulation anchored in self-respect. You feel the pressure. You acknowledge it internally. You respond from clarity, not fear. Every time I failed a test, the dynamic shifted slightly. More expectation, less appreciation. More demand, less reciprocity. It was gradual, invisible if you weren't looking, but cumulative. By the time the relationship felt unbalanced, the foundation had already been set. Men often ask why women change over time. They don't. They respond to what's allowed. Early behavior predicts later behavior because early responses teach people what's possible. The most damaging lie men tell themselves is that things will improve once commitment is secured. Commitment amplifies existing patterns. It doesn't correct them. If respect isn't present early, it won't appear later out of goodwill. Once I understood this, I stopped trying to pass tests by pleasing. I started passing by remaining aligned. That meant being willing to disappoint, to pause, to say no without justification, to let silence do its work. Some interactions ended quickly, others deepened. That was the point. The goal isn't to keep every woman interested. It's to allow the right ones to stay, while the wrong ones remove themselves. Testing doesn't end when attraction begins. It intensifies. Attraction increases stakes. Stakes increase pressure. Pressure reveals truth. That truth is either something you can build on or something you need to walk away from. I learned that failing a test early is a gift. It reveals incompatibility before investment. The real danger is passing by surrendering. That creates relationships that look stable on the surface and rot underneath. From that point forward, I treated every interaction as information, not evidence of worth, not proof of failure. Information, neutral, useful, clarifying. Once you see the tests, you can't unsee them. And once you stop fearing them, they stop controlling you. The difference between passing and failing a test is not effort. It's alignment. I had always assumed that success in relationships came from giving more. More patience, more reassurance, more flexibility. What I eventually saw was that effort without structure creates collapse. The more I gave, the less weight my presence carried. A test is not a request. It's a situation that reveals priority. When I treated every moment of tension as something to resolve, I revealed that resolution mattered more to me than self-respect. That revelation shaped how I was treated going forward. There is a critical misunderstanding among men. They believe attraction is maintained by comfort. Comfort matters, but only after respect is established. Comfort without respect breeds contempt. Respect without comfort can soften over time. But the reverse rarely happens. I remember the shift clearly. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of small decisions made differently. I stopped explaining myself when no explanation was required. I stopped negotiating boundaries that were already reasonable. I stopped filling silence with reassurance. I allowed discomfort to exist without rushing to eliminate it. The response was revealing. Some women leaned in. They became calmer, more cooperative, more attentive. Others pulled away or escalated. They increased emotional pressure. They tested harder. They demanded clarity immediately. Those reactions told me everything I needed to know. Passing a test does not mean compliance. It means demonstrating that your internal state is not dependent on her approval. That independence is what creates stability. A man who is centered doesn't need to dominate. He doesn't need to argue. His presence alone sets limits. Failing a test doesn't always look like rejection. Often it looks like continuation without respect. She stays. She engages. But the tone changes, expectations increase, appreciation fades. The dynamic becomes transactional. That is the most dangerous failure because it feels like success at first. When men talk about being friend-zoned or used, they often ignore the early signals. They passed every test by overgiving. They demonstrated availability without selectivity. They offered resources without requiring reciprocity. They trained the dynamic they now resent. What's cruel is that the behaviors men are praised for, socially being agreeable, being understanding, being endlessly patient, are the same behaviors that undermine attraction when applied without discernment. Virtue without boundaries is not virtue. It's fear wearing moral language. I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. I wasn't losing attraction because I wasn't good enough. I was losing it because I removed all friction. Friction creates polarity. Polarity creates desire. When everything is smooth, because one person absorbs all tension, polarity dies. Women don't respect men who sacrifice themselves to maintain harmony. They feel unsafe with them, not physically, psychologically. A man who won't stand his ground cannot lead when circumstances demand it. Instinct recognizes this long before logic does. The moment I stopped trying to be liked and started being consistent, the tests changed. They became less frequent, less intense. Not because I had proven myself once, but because my behavior no longer invited escalation. Boundaries enforced calmly reduce pressure. Boundaries enforced emotionally increase it. There is a quiet confidence in saying no and meaning it, not as punishment, not as control, as truth. That confidence is contagious. It either invites respect or triggers resistance. Both outcomes are useful. Men often fear that holding boundaries will push women away. Sometimes it does. That is not failure. That is filtration. The women who leave because you won't collapse were never compatible with a stable dynamic. Losing them early is not loss. It's protection. I learned to watch for one thing above all else, how she responded to my consistency. Not my charm, not my generosity, my consistency. When my words matched my actions and my limits were enforced without anger, her response told me whether respect was possible. The irony is that maintaining standards feels risky only when you don't believe you have options. Scarcity makes boundaries feel like threats. Abundance makes them feel natural. When you trust that walking away is survivable, you stop clinging to approval. Failing a test by being overly accommodating doesn't just affect attraction. It shapes the entire trajectory of the relationship. It determines who adapts and who demands, who leads and who follows, who sacrifices and who benefits. Once that pattern is set reversing, it is nearly impossible. Attempts to reclaim boundaries later are often met with confusion or hostility, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it contradicts the role you've already accepted. That's why early responses matter. Not because early moments are more important, but because they define the frame. And once a frame is established, everything inside it is interpreted accordingly. Passing tests is not about proving strength. It's about demonstrating self-trust. You trust your perceptions. You trust your limits. You trust your ability to walk away. That trust communicates itself without words. When I finally understood this, relationships stopped feeling exhausting. I no longer felt like I was auditioning. I was evaluating. I wasn't trying to manage outcomes. I was observing patterns. The difference was subtle but decisive. I wasn't colder. I was clearer. And clarity removes confusion on both sides. Attraction built on clarity is quiet, stable, predictable in the best way. Attraction built on accommodation is anxious, volatile, unsustainable. Once you've lived, both the choice becomes obvious. Once I stopped blaming situations and started observing patterns, certain types of women became unmistakable. Not because they announced themselves, but because their behavior followed predictable structures. These weren't flaws that could be fixed with patience or love. They were configurations, and every configuration carries a cost. The first pattern I learned to recognize was the emotional bomb. At first, she appeared passionate, expressive, alive. Small disagreements escalated quickly. A delayed reply became a personal rejection. A neutral comment became an attack. Her emotions didn't rise and fall, they detonated, and every explosion required immediate attention. Living near an emotional bomb rewires your nervous system. You start scanning for danger. You choose words carefully. You rehearse conversations before they happen. Peace becomes conditional, temporary, earned through constant accommodation. Over time, you confuse intensity with intimacy. You believe managing her emotions means you matter. In reality, you are just the blast radius. Then there was the validation vampire. She didn't explode, she drained. She needed constant reassurance to feel stable. Compliments, attention, presence. If my focus shifted elsewhere, tension appeared, subtle at first, then sharper. She framed it as closeness, as connection, but the pattern was clear. My attention regulated her self-worth. The problem with validation vampires isn't affection, it's responsibility. You become responsible for maintaining her emotional baseline. When she feels insecure, it's because you didn't give enough. When she feels anxious, it's because you weren't available. Your goals become interruptions, your silence becomes abandonment. Next was the controller. She spoke softly at first. Suggestions, concerns, advice, all reasonable in isolation. But the direction was consistent. My friends were questionable. My work priorities were inefficient. My hobbies were immature. None of it was framed as control. It was framed as improvement. Controllers don't demand submission. They erode autonomy, one concession at a time. You start adjusting to avoid friction. You rationalize. You tell yourself compromise is part of partnership. Then one day you look up and realize your life has been redesigned around her preferences. Your independence didn't disappear. You surrendered it. The entitled princess was easier to spot once I learned the signs. She believed her presence was the contribution. Everything else was my responsibility. Planning, paying, initiating. She expected effort as proof of interest, but offered minimal reciprocity. Any request for balance was met with offense, as if mutual effort was an insult. With her, relationships were transactions. My role was to enhance her lifestyle. Her role was to be appreciated. Gratitude was rare. Entitlement was constant. The more I gave, the more she expected. There was no finish line, only escalation. Then there was the chaos creator, the most deceptive of all. She thrived on instability. Calm felt foreign to her, threatening. When things settled, she stirred. A conflict, a misunderstanding, a sudden crisis. Not because something was wrong, but because peace offered no stimulation. With chaos, creator's resolution is temporary. Just as one issue ends, another begins. You mistake turbulence for depth. You believe intensity means importance. Over time, your life becomes reactive. You stop building. You start managing. Stability becomes something you fantasize about, not something you experience. What connects all these types is not malice. It's incompatibility. These patterns don't respond to love. They consume it. No amount of understanding corrects them. No level of patience resolves them. They require constant energy to sustain and return nothing durable in exchange. The danger is not entering these dynamics. The danger is staying. And men stay because they confuse familiarity with connection. They invest time and effort hoping for transformation. They believe if they just hold on long enough, things will stabilize. They don't. These patterns don't improve under pressure. They intensify. Emotional bombs explode more frequently. Validation vampires demand more. Controllers tighten their grip. Entitled princesses escalate expectations. Chaos creators manufacture higher stakes. The cost isn't just emotional, it's structural. Your focus narrows, your ambition slows, your confidence erodes. You start questioning your instincts. You normalize stress. You mistake survival for commitment. I stayed longer than I should have in more than one of these dynamics. Not because I didn't see the signs, because I didn't trust myself enough to act on them. I believed leaving meant failure. I believed endurance was strength. It's not. Strength is recognizing patterns early and responding decisively. Strength is understanding that attraction does not equal compatibility. Strength is accepting that some connections are expensive in ways you can't afford. Once I learned to identify these types, testing became clearer. I wasn't testing for perfection. I was testing for stability, for reciprocity, for the ability to handle calm without creating conflict. The moment you stop trying to save people from themselves, your life becomes lighter. You realize that your role is not to absorb dysfunction. Your role is to choose alignment. Every one of these patterns reveals itself early. Not through confession, through reaction. How she handles disappointment, how she responds to boundaries, how she treats people who can't benefit her, how she behaves when things don't go her way. Men ignore these signals because they're afraid of being alone. That fear is costly. It keeps you tied to dynamics that slowly dismantle you. Once I accepted that not every woman deserved access to my life, these patterns lost their power. I didn't argue. I didn't diagnose. I disengaged. And that decision alone changed everything. To understand why these patterns exist, I had to stop looking at behavior as personal and start looking at it as inherited. Not learned in a classroom, not taught deliberately, inherited through survival. Female psychology was shaped under conditions where the wrong choice carried severe consequences. Weak partners meant vulnerability. Unreliable partners meant scarcity. Emotionally unstable partners meant danger. Over thousands of generations, women who evaluated poorly didn't leave descendants. Women who evaluated well did. The result wasn't kindness or cruelty. It was selectivity, pressure, testing. What survives gets passed on. What doesn't disappears. This is why women test confidence. Confidence historically correlated with status competence and access to resources. It wasn't arrogance they were drawn to. It was certainty. A man who knows where he stands can make decisions under pressure. That mattered when survival depended on leadership. They test boundaries because boundaries indicate structure. A man who enforces his standards can enforce protection. A man who negotiates his limits under pressure signals uncertainty. Uncertainty spreads. In dangerous environments, uncertainty kills. They test emotional stability because reactive men make poor decisions. A man who collapses emotionally under stress becomes a liability. One who remains composed becomes an anchor. Women are drawn to anchors because chaos is already guaranteed by life itself. Understanding this removed resentment. It also removed excuses. Biology explains behavior. It doesn't justify unlimited tolerance. Recognizing the origin of a test doesn't require you to submit to it indefinitely. The mistake men make is interpreting these tests as moral judgments. They're not. They're functional evaluations. Does this man hold shape when conditions change? Or does he disintegrate and seek external regulation? When men fail these tests, attraction doesn't fade because women are cruel. It fades because instincts override intention. Desire cannot be negotiated with logic. Respect cannot be begged into existence. What most men don't realize is that passing these tests doesn't require dominance. It requires coherence, internal alignment. A man who knows his direction doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to threaten. He doesn't need to explain himself endlessly. The tests exist to reveal traits that historically ensured survival. That doesn't mean modern relationships are about survival. But instincts don't update on social timelines. They operate on ancient code. Female testing strategies persist even in environments where survival isn't at stake. Dating apps, social media, modern cities. The context changes. The code remains. Ignoring that reality doesn't make it disappear. It just makes you vulnerable. But here is the boundary most men never learn to draw. Understanding evolutionary pressure does not obligate you to endure every test or violation. Passing a test once does not mean agreeing to repeat it forever. Stability invites reduction, not escalation. A woman who respects you doesn't need to keep pushing. Pressure decreases when structure is proven. Pressure increases when structure is absent or inconsistent. I saw this clearly when I stopped overcorrecting. I didn't try to outsmart tests. I didn't play games. I responded once calmly and consistently. If the same test appeared again, that wasn't curiosity. That was disregard. Repeated testing after clear boundaries is not evaluation. It's extraction, and extraction signals incompatibility. This distinction matters. Many men stay because they believe persistence will eventually satisfy her doubts. It won't. If structure doesn't reduce pressure, nothing will. There's also a misconception that women enjoy testing. They don't. Testing is stressful. It creates uncertainty. What women want is resolution, a sense that the man in front of them is stable enough to stop the process. Men who remain reactive prolong testing. Men who remain centered end it. The paradox is that men often become reactive because they want the testing to stop. They explain, they reassure, they overinvest. That behavior restarts the process. It introduces new uncertainty, new questions. I learned that attraction stabilizes when a woman feels she understands who you are and what you will tolerate. Ambiguity invites pressure. Clarity resolves it. This is why inconsistency is so damaging. A boundary enforced once and then abandoned teaches her nothing. It invites more probing. Consistency teaches faster than intensity ever could. Once I understood the evolutionary logic, I stopped moralizing behavior. I stopped taking it personally. And in doing so, I gained leverage without trying to control anything. Leverage isn't power over someone. It's power over your own responses. When you can walk away without drama, the dynamic is balanced. When you can't, it's not. Modern men are taught that understanding equals tolerance. It doesn't. Understanding equals informed choice. You can empathize with the origin of behavior and still reject its impact on your life. This perspective changed how I selected partners. I wasn't looking for someone who never tested. That doesn't exist. I was looking for someone whose testing diminished when clarity was established. The right woman doesn't push endlessly. She observes, assesses, and settles. The wrong one escalates indefinitely because instability is her baseline. Evolution doesn't excuse chaos. It explains it. What you do with that explanation determines whether your life becomes stable or remains reactive. Once you see testing as information rather than threat, fear disappears. And without fear, you respond from choice, not compulsion. That is the shift most men never make. And it's why they keep repeating the same painful patterns with different faces. After understanding why women test, the next step was recognizing how those tests operate simultaneously, not in isolation, not one at a time. Female evaluation is layered. While one test is visible, 3 others are running beneath the surface. Most men fail not because they respond poorly to one moment, but because they don't realize they're being evaluated across multiple dimensions at once. The first dimension is boundary testing. This is the most obvious and yet the most misunderstood. Boundaries are rarely challenged directly at the start. They're nudged, slightly. A late arrival, a last-minute cancellation, a request that ignores your schedule. Each small violation asks the same question. Will he enforce his standards or absorb inconvenience to maintain approval? When I absorbed it, the violations increased. Not immediately, gradually. When I enforced calmly without emotion or explanation, the pressure decreased. Boundaries don't require defense. They require consistency. Inconsistency invites escalation. The second dimension is emotional stability testing. This one is subtle because it often masquerades as vulnerability. A sudden mood shift, a dramatic interpretation of a neutral event, a conflict over something trivial. The content doesn't matter. The reaction does. She wasn't watching whether I cared. She was watching whether I unraveled. A man who becomes defensive, apologetic, or reactive under emotional pressure reveals instability. A man who stays grounded, acknowledges emotion without surrendering his center signals reliability. Most men confuse emotional engagement with emotional leadership. They mirror intensity instead of regulating it. That mirroring creates chaos. Regulation creates safety. The third dimension is investment testing. This test reveals scarcity. How much am I willing to give before anything is established? How quickly do I sacrifice time, energy, or resources to secure attention? Overinvestment early feels generous. It isn't. It signals urgency. Urgency suggests limited options. Limited options reduce perceived value. When I slowed my investment and maintained balance, interest either deepened or evaporated. Both outcomes were informative. A woman who is genuinely interested doesn't need to extract proof through sacrifice. She reciprocates naturally. When effort flows in one direction, only the dynamic is already broken. The fourth dimension is competition testing. This test exposes self-perception, mentions of other men, casual flirting with alternatives, stories designed to create comparison. These moments test whether I perceive myself as replaceable or grounded. Jealousy is not the issue, is. Reactivity is. Calm confidence communicates self-worth. Silence rooted in insecurity does not. The difference is internal. One is stable. The other is suppressed fear. When I reacted emotionally, the test intensified. When I remained centered, it ended. Competition testing doesn't seek dominance. It seeks clarity. Where does he stand relative to others in his own mind? What most men miss is that these tests are happening at the same time. A late arrival might also be an investment test. A mood swing might also be a boundary test. A casual mention of an ex might combine emotional stability and competition. If you treat each moment independently, you miss the pattern. Patterns matter more than events. My early mistake was responding tactically. fixing one situation at a time. That approach never works. The correct response is structural. Who am I being in this interaction? Am I aligned, or am I adjusting myself to avoid discomfort? Women don't evaluate isolated actions. They evaluate trajectories. Does his behavior move toward self-respect or away from it? Toward clarity or confusion? Every time I over-explained, I weakened my position. Every time I justified a boundary, I invited negotiation. Boundaries that require explanation are already compromised. There is also a test most men never consider: the patience test. How long will he tolerate ambiguity without clarity? Men who wait indefinitely for certainty communicate low self-worth. Men who set timelines internally and act accordingly communicate value. I stopped waiting for relationships to define themselves. I observed, I decided. If clarity didn't emerge through mutual effort, I disengaged. Not angrily, not dramatically, quietly. That behavior alone eliminated most dysfunction. Female testing is not malicious. It's adaptive. But adaptation doesn't stop unless conditions stabilize. Men who remain unclear create ongoing evaluation. Men who are clear resolve it. The moment I stopped fearing tests, I stopped failing them. Fear drives overreaction. Overreaction destabilizes the dynamic. Stability resolves it. One of the most important realizations was this: passing a test once doesn't grant immunity. Structure must be maintained. Not rigidly, consistently. A boundary enforced once and then abandoned teaches nothing. Emotional stability displayed once and then lost creates confusion. Investment balanced early and then skewed later resets the evaluation. Women respond to patterns, not promises. Men often ask how to win these tests. That question reveals the problem. There is no winning. There is only alignment or misalignment. The right response isn't designed to impress. It's designed to be honest. Honesty doesn't mean disclosure. It means congruence. Your actions match your values. Your responses match your standards. Your presence matches your words. When those elements align, testing decreases naturally. When they don't, pressure increases. I learned to stop reacting and start observing. To treat every interaction as data. How does she respond when I don't rush, when I don't fix, when I don't compete, when I don't explain? Her responses told me more than any conversation ever could. The goal was never control, it was clarity. Control creates resistance. Clarity creates alignment. Once I internalized that interactions stopped feeling like trials, they became filters, efficient, revealing, protective. And that's when relationships stopped draining me. Understanding how women test men is only half the equation. The imbalance I had lived with for years came from one critical omission. I was being evaluated constantly, but I wasn't evaluating in return. I was reacting instead of selecting. That reversal changed everything. Testing women is not manipulation. It's observation under mild pressure. It's creating small moments that reveal character, not forcing outcomes. If a woman cannot handle minimal expectations with composure, she will not handle real life with stability. The first test I began using was the respect test. I made small, reasonable requests that required minimal effort. Meeting at a specific location instead of adjusting to her convenience. Asking her to confirm plans, suggesting a time that worked for my schedule. The content of the request didn't matter. The response did. A woman who respected me responded with ease. She accommodated without resistance or negotiation. A woman who didn't saw the request as an imposition. She delayed. She reframed. She subtly pushed responsibility back onto me. Respect reveals itself in small moments, not grand gestures. Next was the flexibility test. Life is unpredictable. Plans change. Energy shifts. I would occasionally alter a plan or introduce something unplanned, nothing disruptive, just enough to observe her reaction. Women who were adaptable adjusted smoothly. They didn't internalize the change as rejection. They didn't dramatize inconvenience. Women who lacked flexibility reacted with frustration or control. They needed certainty to feel safe. That rigidity becomes a problem when life inevitably becomes uncertain. The investment test followed naturally. Instead of handling every detail, I allowed space for her contribution. I asked her to choose a place, to bring something small, to suggest the next meeting. I didn't demand. I observed. Women who were interested contributed willingly, often without being asked. Women who expected entertainment without effort remained passive. Their lack of contribution wasn't confusion, it was entitlement. Effort reveals interest, always. Then there was the boundary test. This was the most important and the most uncomfortable. I stated preferences clearly. Communication limits, time boundaries, physical pacing, not as ultimatums, as facts. Her response told me everything. Respectful women acknowledged and adjusted. Unhealthy women negotiated, minimized, or attempted to override. Boundary pushers don't stop pushing. They escalate. What I learned is that you don't need elaborate tests. Character reveals itself quickly when mild friction is introduced. People with integrity adjust. People without it resist. Interpreting responses correctly is crucial. Not every hesitation means disinterest. Not every compliance means sincerity. Patterns matter. A woman with high interest and good character responds with enthusiasm and often adds value. She doesn't just comply, she contributes. She respects boundaries and expresses appreciation for clarity. She makes interaction easier, not heavier. A woman with moderate interest responds without enthusiasm. She complies, but rarely initiates. She respects boundaries, but occasionally tests consistency. She's open, but not invested. This isn't wrong. It just requires measured investment. A woman with low interest negotiates every request. She delays. She reframes. She resists boundaries. She expects effort while offering little in return. Her behavior signals that she doesn't see you as a priority. Then there is the explosive response. Anger, offense, drama over reasonable expectations. This is not passion, it's instability. This response disqualifies immediately. No explanation required. Women categorize men quickly, not consciously. Functionally, understanding those categories explains treatment. When a woman places you on the provider track, she minimizes intimacy and maximizes investment. She expects resources, time, attention, commitment. She offers minimal reciprocation and always has a reason why more must be delayed. On the validation track, she enjoys your attention without emotional availability. She engages when she needs reassurance and disappears when you need reciprocity. You are an emotional resource, not a partner. On the lover track, effort flows both ways. She accommodates, she invests, she initiates. She wants proximity, she wants connection. She treats you as someone to please, not manage. These tracks are not assigned based on words. They're assigned based on behavior. Once assigned, they rarely change. Most men fail at testing women because they're afraid of losing attention. Even bad attention feels better than none. That fear turns men into applicants instead of selectors. Scarcity mindset destroys discernment. When you believe options are limited, you rationalize behavior you would otherwise reject. You overinvest to secure position. That behavior confirms the very insecurity you're trying to hide. Abundance is not arrogance. It's accuracy. There are many women. Few are compatible. Knowing the difference frees you. I learned that walking away was the most powerful test of all. Not as a threat, as a reality. When a woman sensed I could disengage without resentment, dynamics shifted. Respect increased, or the interaction ended. Both outcomes were success. Testing women doesn't make you cold. It makes you responsible. It prevents you from investing in dynamics that will erode you over time. The men who suffer most are not those who choose poorly once. They are the ones who ignore patterns repeatedly because they're afraid to choose at all. Once I accepted my role as an evaluator, relationships stopped feeling like auditions. I wasn't trying to be chosen. I was choosing. That change alone saved me years of confusion. Once I began testing women instead of chasing outcomes, another layer of clarity emerged. It wasn't just about how she responded to individual moments. It was about what her responses revealed about the categories she had already placed me in. Women don't wait for certainty to decide how to treat a man. They assign him a role early and adjust behavior accordingly. Understanding those roles explained years of confusion. When a woman sees a man as a provider, her behavior follows a predictable script. Physical intimacy slows. Emotional availability becomes conditional. Investment requirements increase. Dates become more expensive. Expectations grow heavier. There is always a reason why she needs more time, more proof, more effort before offering anything deeper. On the provider track, affection is rationed. Attention is transactional. The man is valuable for what he supplies, not who he is. Many men stay here because it feels like progress. They mistake delayed intimacy for seriousness. In reality, they are being evaluated for extraction, not partnership. Then there is the validation track. This one is subtle and dangerous because it feels emotionally rewarding at first. She responds warmly to attention. She enjoys compliments. She shares just enough vulnerability to create closeness. But when the man asks for reciprocity, the energy shifts. Validation track men exist to regulate her self-esteem. They are emotional mirrors. She reaches out when she needs reassurance and disappears when she doesn't. Commitment remains vague. Effort remains one-sided. The man confuses emotional access with romantic intent. The lover track is unmistakable once you've seen it. Effort flows naturally in both directions. She initiates contact. She accommodates schedules. She invests without prompting. Intimacy is not withheld as leverage. It emerges organically. On this track, the woman is not testing endlessly. She is confirming. She already sees the man as a viable partner and behaves accordingly. Respect is present early because it was established early. Most men never experience the lover track consistently because they overinvest before being placed on it. They try to buy desire with effort. Desire doesn't work that way. Effort confirms value only after attraction is established, not before. Understanding which track you're on is essential because it determines how you should invest. Over-investing on the provider or validation track deepens the imbalance. Withholding investment on the lover track can kill momentum. Discernment matters. The reason most men fail at this stage is scarcity thinking. They're terrified of losing female attention even when that attention comes with poor treatment. They cling to potential instead of responding to reality. Scarcity turns men into negotiators of their own standards. They accept behavior they would advise their friends to leave. They rationalize, they wait, they hope. Hope is not a strategy. When a man fears loss, he tolerates disrespect. That tolerance signals low self-worth. Women sense it immediately, not consciously, instinctively. It reduces attraction and invites further testing. Abundance changes everything. And abundance is not about having dozens of women. It's about knowing you can walk away and survive. That knowledge removes urgency. Without urgency, clarity appears. When I stopped clinging to attention, I stopped being manipulated by it. I could see behavior without filtering it through fear. I could respond instead of react. Walking away became simple, not dramatic, not resentful, just final. Modern dating environments make this more important than ever. Social media provides women with endless validation. Dating apps create the illusion of infinite options. These conditions reduce incentives for self-regulation and increase incentives for extraction. At the same time, the risks for men have increased. Emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, legal consequences, false narratives. Choosing poorly carries heavier costs than it did in the past. This isn't paranoia, it's awareness. Certain psychological patterns create predictable dysfunction. Cluster B personality traits don't soften with love. Victim mentality turns partners into caretakers. Addiction redirects loyalty. Financial irresponsibility becomes shared crisis. Family dysfunction recreates chaos unless addressed directly. Men ignore these signals because they're attracted. Attraction blinds judgment. Biology pushes short-term thinking. Culture discourages selectivity. Testing exists to counter those forces. Effective testing requires the willingness to disqualify. Disqualification is not punishment. It's protection. Every month spent with the wrong woman is a month unavailable to the right one. Poor relationships don't just waste time. They drain energy. They erode confidence. They narrow future options. Strategic disqualification requires discipline. It means holding standards, even when lonely. It means choosing temporary discomfort over long-term damage. Most men won't do this. They'll accept familiar suffering instead of risking uncertainty. They'll stay in roles that diminish them because at least those roles feel known. But for the men who choose differently, the shift is immediate. Selectivity attracts respect. Boundaries invite effort. Walking away filters chaos. The moment you stop auditioning, you stop being treated as disposable. At that point, relationships stop feeling like battles. They become choices. And choice is the foundation of power. The most important lesson I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it's simple. The quality of your life is determined less by who you attract and more by who you allow to stay. Most damage doesn't come from obvious disasters. It comes from slow compromises, from explaining away early discomfort, from silencing your instincts because you're afraid of being alone. Respect is not something you negotiate later. It's something you establish early through clarity, consistency, and the willingness to walk away. When you ignore that, you don't just invite poor treatment from others. You teach yourself that your time, energy, and peace are negotiable. And once you accept that internally, the world responds accordingly. A meaningful life isn't built by avoiding discomfort. It's built by choosing the right discomfort. The discomfort of setting boundaries. The discomfort of saying no. The discomfort of being misunderstood for a while, rather than slowly erasing yourself to keep someone close. Loneliness passes. Self-respect compounds. This isn't about blaming women. It isn't about control. It's about responsibility. About recognizing that you are the gatekeeper of your own future. Every relationship you enter either sharpens you or dulls you, strengthens you or drains you. And the difference is rarely luck. It's choice. If this message resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you want more conversations like this, quiet, honest, and grounded, consider subscribing to the channel. We're not here for comfort. We're here for clarity.